My name is Ian Hoffman. I'm with the Electricity Markets and Policy Group here at LBNL, and I want to welcome you all to our webinar on a new report that we issued 2 weeks ago about concerning the Program Administrator Cost of Saved Energy for utility customer-funded energy efficiency programs. This is the first product, or one of the first products for the Cost of Saved Energy project here at LBL, which we see as supporting a number of other projects here and missions that include technical assistance to state and local governments and utilities on energy efficiency, policy, practice, and programs. Let me hit a few logistical details. All the phones will be muted throughout the presentation, in part because we're recording the webinar, but we welcome questions throughout, either clarifying or substantive questions through the chat box, which should appear in the lower left of your screens. I'll try answering the clarifying questions during the webinar, but save the more substantive ones for our Q&A session at the end. And a recording of this webinar will be posted to the resource page for the Cost of Saved Energy report within about a week. And with that, I'd like to introduce Chuck Goldman and Megan Billingsley. Chuck is the head of the Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Department here at LBL and was the principal investigator for this project. And Megan Billingsley is the lead author on the report and has been project lead. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Chuck.
Thanks, Ian. As you can see from this first slide, we have a large team that's been working on this project. I wanted to thank our funders at the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, and specifically our program manager, Larry Mansuetti, who has supported this work for the last several years. What I hope to cover, Megan and I are going to tag team this. I'm going to talk about project scope and objectives and findings and recommendations, and Megan is going to focus on describing the program impacts database and the results. In terms of the overview of what we're going to talk about, we are going to talk about our scope and objectives, the approach that we use to collecting the data, how we tried to define in a systematic way program costs and savings, and as well as a program metric of the levelized cost of saved energy. Megan's going to talk about the sample of programs in the database to give you a feel for that relative to what's going on there nationally, and she'll discuss the results from this first report, and then I'll try to bring it together with some discussion about findings and recommendations about where we go next and some issues for state regulators and program administrators and other key stakeholders to consider as they work in the energy efficiency program arena. In terms of this project, there have been a number of other studies in recent years that have looked at the regional or the national cost of saved energy, typically at the portfolio or sector level. There's been several studies by ACEEE and also other researchers. We believe that this is the first study that to take a very large-scale data set to look at, to attempt to do a program-level kind of analysis across many program administrators. That's one of the contributions of this work. Other studies have also had a sort of more limited data sets in terms of number of administrators or states that they covered. In terms of approach, we collected and analyzed program data that was filed by investor-owned utilities in this study. These are annual reports filed to state regulators, filed by program administrators, either utilities or other entities that administer these customer-funded efficiency programs. In turn, we also then tried to define cost of saved energy metric in a couple different ways, but we focused mainly on a levelized cost of saved energy, which Megan will talk about in more detail. And we did that for both electric and gas energy efficiency programs. In terms of our objectives, we want to encourage more consistent reporting of energy efficiency program impacts and costs by program administrators using common reporting guidelines. We also think that this kind of work can help enable more cost-effective efficiency portfolios by identifying design, implementation, and other drivers that influence the cost of saved energy, and by benchmarking program implementation experience and the range in cost of saved energy values across different markets, residential, commercial, industrial, and different types of program designs, whether they be rebate programs, custom rebate, direct install. You'll see there's a large typology of programs. In terms of audiences for this work, We hope that the work will be useful to state regulators, to policymakers, to resource planners, at utilities and independent system operators, and program administrators. And we have some ideas about how the work might be helpful. We think for program administrators it might be useful to be able to benchmark and compare alternative types and design of efficiency programs, to look at some issues about the depth of savings per program dollar invested. It can be helpful in screening among program options within a portfolio. For DSM resource planners and other stakeholders, we know that in some cases, for example, ISOs and others are forecasting. You may have an idea of future budgets, but you have to forecast savings in your load forecast out 5 and 10 years. We think this kind of work can help inform those kinds of efforts. For state regulators, the cost of saved energy is an initial screening level tool that could be useful in comparing among different types of efficiency program options. And it can be, at a screening level, be roughly compared to the levelized cost of supply side options, depending on how complete and comprehensive the cost reporting is on the efficiency side. We want to note that this is not a benefit cost analysis, but it can provide inputs that are useful to a screening analysis. In terms of data collection, we cast a very wide net in this initial study. We attempted to collect data from program administrators in the 45 states that we know of that are currently running utility customer-funded efficiency programs that are being sponsored by at least investor-owned utilities. We ultimately were able to get data from over 100 program administrators, 107 to be exact, in 31 states, including both electric, natural gas, and combined utilities. We collected data for 3 years, from 2009 to 11, and we collected data on over 1,700 individual programs. Roughly about 4,000 data points, program years, are in our data set. In terms of the type of information that we tried to collect information on net and gross savings, both in terms of either annual incremental first-year savings or lifetime savings over the measures that were installed in programs. We tried to collect pretty disaggregated cost information, administrative costs, incentive costs, evaluation costs, education, marketing, and outreach costs. There is a wide variety of ways in which these costs are reported and at different levels of detail. We've also tried to collect information on participant costs, measure lifetimes for programs, and the number of program participants. The richness of the data set declines as you work down this list of metrics, and we'll show you more about the kind of data reporting that we were able to get on participant costs and number of program participants. In terms of standardizing the data, we adopted the definitions for program impacts that have been developed by the State Energy Efficiency Action Network in the report Energy Efficiency Program Impact Evaluation Guide. And we also, one of the contributions of this work was we went through a pretty lengthy iterative process, looking at work that other folks had done in the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships and at the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, and by looking at the data across all these programs. And we ultimately developed the program typology in order to characterize and analyze similar types of efficiency programs. We also have been working with the Consortium for Energy Efficiency to adapt this program typology for use by them in their annual industry survey of program administrators. This chart gives you a simplified view of what this program typology looks like. And it sort of works from to different finer levels of resolution. We tried to think about it at the sectoral level in terms of residential, commercial, industrial, and agricultural, cross-cutting types of programs, low-income programs. We also have a category for demand response, which we didn't really collect data on in this first study. So we also created 27 simple categories of programs across these 7 sectors, and then drilled down one further level at a detailed category level. And so our staff categorized each of these 1,700 programs based on looking at the program descriptions, the information that was available, talking to administrators and regulators in some cases, using expert judgment in other cases. But it was a pretty elaborate process, and again, there's always judgment when you do this kind of stuff. But it was the first attempt to see if we could do it and if we could produce meaningful results through this kind of effort. It also allows us to sort of reveal the trends in program designs over time. And you can see that as you look at the data at administrator levels, from administrators that are starting out with a set of core programs to administrators that have been running programs for 10, 15 years that have 50 to 100 different kinds of programs that they're offering. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the data that we captured during in the LBNL DSM program impacts database. So during our data collection efforts, we really focused on collecting data from program administrators that had readily accessible annual reports. And these reports needed to include both expenditures and savings broken out by fuel type at the program level. So the chart on this slide compares the expenditures in the LBL database, again broken out by fuel type, to the reported expenditures from the CEE annual survey. And as you can see, we've captured roughly 50% of the spending for the 2009 to 2011 time period. I do want to point out that the combined fuel expenditures you see here in dark gray are not included in the cost of saved energy analysis. And this is because we could not attribute the program expenditures by fuel savings and therefore could not calculate a cost of saved energy. And then a few other things to note before we move on. I mentioned that the data is from 2009 to 2011. We are reporting all expenditures in 2012 dollars to account for inflation, and then any first-year or lifetime savings values that I discuss going forward, these are going to be gross savings values, not net. So this is a snapshot of the data that we've collected. I'm going to focus on electric programs today. However, the main report does include more information about gas programs if you are curious. These charts break out the expenditures and savings by sector. You can see that of the $5.3 billion in our database program administrator expenditures, about 61% was spent on commercial and industrial programs. And this is on the far left pie chart. Residential program expenditures are about 29%, and the remainder is split between low-income programs and what we call cross-sector, which is a mixture of programs or activities that are not typically targeted towards a single specific sector. So these things can include everything from multi-sector rebate programs to market transformation to EM&V activities. And then as you look across the pie charts, you kind of at the far right, you'll see lifetime savings, and you can see that the expenditure percentages by sector stay roughly the same. We've got 31% of the total lifetime gross savings is residential, and about 62% is for C&I. So the report goes into a greater detail about the breakout of spending and savings by sector and at the program level, but I did want to quickly demonstrate how this program typology that Chuck discussed can work. So in this chart, we're going to show, you can see the residential sector lifetime gross savings. In the chart on the left, we've broken out all of the residential savings at what we call the simplified program category. So at the simplified level, you can see that about 52% of the residential savings is coming from this consumer product rebate category. But when you look at the detailed breakdown, which is then the detailed program category at the pie chart on the right, you can see that of that consumer product rebate, about the vast majority of it is coming from lighting, and this winds up being about 44% of the total residential savings. So just keep this in mind as we start discussing some of the results from the cost of saved energy analysis. So moving on to the analysis. I'm going to start by defining the levelized cost of saved energy. And we define it as the cost of acquiring energy savings that accrue over the economic lifetime of actions, which are then discounted back to the year in which the costs are paid and the actions occurred. And to calculate this, we really need four things. We'll need a discount rate, which for the purposes of this study, we used a 6% real discount rate, which is roughly comparable to the utility weighted average cost of capital. We also need an estimate on how long the savings from a program or a measure is expected to last, and this is what we call the program average measure lifetime. And then finally, we need the program administrator costs and savings, which we got from Annual Report Center in the Program Impacts database. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, to calculate the cost of saved energy, we need an estimate of the economic lifetime of savings for each program, which means that we either need lifetime savings for each program or an average lifetime for the mix of measures installed by the program. And during our data collection, we found that about 50% of the program administrators reported either or both of these values. And so what you're looking at here is a range of reported program average measure lifetime values. And we were actually surprised by how large the range is for some of these program types. For example, the residential new construction program lifetime values range from 8 to 34 years. So some of this can be attributed to the differences in the measure mixes that programs have. But we think that there are also examples of the different jurisdictions applying different measure lifetime values for the same equipment in neighboring states. So I mentioned that 50% didn't report either lifetime or a program average measure lifetime savings or the average measure lifetime. For those programs, what we did was we calculated an average measure lifetime value by program type, and then we applied that average value to the programs that didn't report any information. Yes, so I do want to reiterate that we are focusing on program administrator costs. These are not total resource costs. And then we're going to look at the cost of saved energy at the national and regional levels by sector and then by program type. And then we calculated the cost of saved energy two different ways. The first is a savings-weighted average cost of saved energy, which basically sums up all of the savings and expenditures at the level analysis and then calculates the cost of saved energy. We also calculated cost of saved energy for each individual program, and we present those results as an interquartile range, or essentially the middle 50% of the total range, and then the median values. And again, this is at the level of analysis, so this is national, sector, or program. And what this does is this individual program-specific CSE really gives equal weighting to all of the programs, regardless of their size. So results. We found that the U.S. savings-weighted average for levelized cost of saved energy for the 2009-2011 time period was slightly more than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. In this chart you see the national results for electric programs by sector. The savings-weighted average CSE values for each sector are shown with the green bar. The interquartile range for program-specific CSE is shown with the blue line, and the median values are shown with the red dotted line. Residential programs had the lowest savings-weighted average at about 1.8 cents a kilowatt hour, followed by C&I, commercial and industrial programs, at 2.1 cents a kilowatt hour. C&I programs had the narrowest interquartile range, with the program-specific CSE ranging somewhere between 1.5 cents and 5 cents a kilowatt hour. With the median value, it's slightly less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour. I do want to point out that for most of our results, the savings-weighted average CSE tends to be lower than the median for the program-specific CSE, which we think is likely showing that larger programs with more savings are driving down the cost of saved energy. So when we start to look at the C&I sector by simplified program category, we find that the most common programs in our data set were custom and prescriptive programs. Both of these program categories had a savings-weighted average of less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour and relatively narrow interquartile ranges. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is that all of the C&I program categories have a savings-weighted average CSE of less than 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Looking at the residential sector, and this is by simplified program category, we can see that all of the categories had savings-weighted average values of less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. But compared to the C&I sector, the range for program-specific CSE is much wider. And you can really see this in the whole home upgrade category, which has a savings-weighted average of about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But the program-specific CSE range has the program-specific CSE has a range of less than 4 cents per kilowatt hour to about 21 cents per kilowatt hour. What we think is driving this range is that the simplified category includes a wide range of different program types. This includes everything from audits to direct install programs to retrofit upgrade programs. And we think that this range in program design and delivery mechanisms may be what's driving that wide range in interquartile range. But if we really want to look at what is driving the residential cost of saved energy, we need to look at the consumer product rebates programs. So if you recall, the lighting programs were about 44% of total residential savings. And what we see here is the savings weighted average CSE for lighting programs is less than 1 cent per kilowatt hour. And there's not really a lot of variation in that interquartile range. I think the other thing I want to note on this slide is that we were actually surprised by the number of appliance recycling programs. You can see that there are about 73 programs. These programs had a savings weighted average of 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which we thought was pretty interesting to note. So looking across the regions, the savings weighted average CSE for the Midwest was the lowest at about 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour. Many of the states there have relatively new energy efficiency resource standards, and at the time of the study were ramping up. So as a result, they may still be able to achieve some pretty significant savings, and at the time were, from programs targeting really low-cost measures, namely lighting. In the Northeast, what we're seeing is a number of states that have had a lot of program activity for a long time. Most of these states have relatively high savings targets, and in many cases a mandate to pursue all cost-effective energy efficiency. I think it's worth noting, though, that all of the states in the Northeast still have savings-weighted average CSEs of less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. On this slide, at the time of the study, you can see that there was not a lot of activity in the South. We were only able to include 4 states in this analysis. We're looking forward to including more in coming years. And then we look at the states in the West, and I think most of the states had a savings-weighted average CSE somewhere between slightly more than 1 cent per kilowatt hour and about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's actually a pretty tight range for that region. Finally, I know that there are a lot of folks who are eager to see a comparison of the program administrator cost of saved energy to the total resource cost of saved energy. Unfortunately, as Chuck mentioned earlier, participant costs were not widely reported by program administrators in their annual reports. Of the programs in our database, about 265 programs, which is less than 10% of the electric programs, included participant costs. So for a relatively small sample size, we actually developed this chart which compares the total resource costs to the program administrator costs where they were reported. And what we see is that the cost of savings values for the total resource were typically, a double, more or less, the program administrator costs for most program types. And the exception is the whole home upgrades, where the cost of saved energy was the total resource cost of saved energy was about 25 to 30% higher than the program administrator CSE. So at this point in time, I would like to turn it back over to Chuck.
Thank you, Megan. So that was a rather whirlwind tour of the results, and we hope that it encourages you to take a closer look at the report. We do have a number of questions that folks have raised that I think we'll get to later, but I do want to, we had one question that said basically the program categories don't seem mutually exclusive, and as a result it's sort of confusing to look at the results dimensioned by those categories. And I think that there's some truth to that. I mean, some program administrators have much more disaggregated reporting of their programs, and they have newer programs, and so sometimes you see programs that are C&I only level programs. Sometimes you see just commercial. Sometimes you see just industrial. I think over time, we hope that people will report the sectoral results somewhat separately so we can actually look at them. But a lot of times we see examples of C&I programs being reported together, as well as there is clearly some overlap in kinds of programs in our 62 categories. So I'm going to turn to the findings and recommendations, and we'll come back to this issue about sort of program typology and reporting. It's clear that conceptually that there are a number of factors that may influence the program administrator's cost of saved energy. Conceptually, you can look for possible explanations for the range in CSE values. There might be differences internal to programs and over which program administrators have some influence, such as the design, the implementation, their own maturity, and the scale of the programs. There are also factors that are external to the programs and over which the program administrators have very little influence. Might be labor costs in a region, the policy framework in which they operate the programs, and the climate region, and so on. And in this chart, we're showing you sort of conceptually some examples of things that might lead to higher costs of saved energy, like labor costs, policy requirements that suggest that administrators should pursue all cost-effective efficiency and in so doing offer pretty comprehensive programs. Other policy frameworks where either you're getting incented to capture savings at the lowest possible cost, or you're going after low-hanging fruit because you're just starting out. But we need to be aware of that. We did some preliminary statistical analysis that we have a chapter on that in the report, but we're not going to spend a lot of time in the webinar about that stuff. We look at that as very preliminary and sort of food for thought in terms of the future. In terms of, it is important to talk about some of the data challenges, and so that we're clear about how these results can be used and what's sort of stretching beyond what's really appropriate. As we noted earlier, there are programs offered in 45 states, and we were able to collect data from administrators in 31 states with sufficient transparency that we could do a program-level cost of saved energy analysis. And what that suggests is that there's a number of administrators in other states who could be reporting their results more completely so that we could do this kind of analysis. It's also clear that many program administrators report at a very high level of completeness and transparency in their annual reports. It's a pretty mixed bag out there. And so we do think that there's sort of room for growth and improvement in some of the states that are newer going up the curve. We also recognize that efficiency reporting practices are a product of state PUC guidelines, policies, and long-running administrative practices. And not surprisingly, the program data are not reported consistently across states. And so some examples of that are that we found that less than 45% of the program administrators actually reported lifetime savings. Only about half of the program administrators reported both net and gross savings. And only about 30% of the program administrators reported participant costs in their annual reports. We know that there's more information out there on participant costs in their DSM planning documents and when they're screening programs, but it's not currently incorporated when they report back to the regulator at the end of the year and that stuff, and it's an area that we think more work could be done on. We also have to acknowledge that energy savings and program costs are often not defined consistently, and we encounter this as we look through all the administrator reports. Probably the most common issue or the biggest challenge is in the lack of a consistent definition of net energy savings across states and how administrators report that issue. But we also found the definition of measure lifetime, how a program's average measure lifetime is determined, and the estimated measure lifetime values for the same measures varies across states. We also found that the allocation of program costs among programs and the kind of reporting is not particularly consistent across states, and so it's somewhat of a challenge. And this also comes up a lot in doing program costs for combined utilities, electric and gas, where there's not always a breakout separately of gas and electric program costs. And finally, there are some examples of even where sectors are not categorized in a standardized fashion. So for example, you'll see examples of multifamily programs being reported in both residential or commercial industrial portfolios sectors by different administrators. I do want to call your attention to a policy brief that we did a couple months ago prior to this report that at least describes our typology in some detail, as well as in the report, and also tries to describe the data metrics that we're using for reporting program costs and savings. That draws heavily on the State Energy Efficiency Action Network guides and the work of CEE in some cases. In terms of reporting guidelines, the program information included in each circle corresponds to gradually increasing visibility into program performance. increasing confidence in the reported values and the potential relevance to policymakers and more stakeholders across these broader geographic areas. At the most basic level of reporting, which is this light blue background, that provides the information that state regulators can use to ensure that their programs are available to all customer classes and that they're cost-effective as implemented. The next level of reporting, this teal background, provides critical information for calculating the cost of saved energy, assessing program efficacy and market penetration, and ensuring that savings are attributable to program activities. So more focused on net savings, net to gross ratios. And this third level of sort of reporting in the purple background enables comparisons of programs and cost performance in different states. It reinforces assessments of program efficacy and allows visibility into some of the key assumptions that drive some of the results. And it also helps ensure that the assumptions are valid and comparable to those being used by other program administrators. And this sort of provides a continuum. We hope that we can urge state PUCs and utilities to at least do the baseline reporting guidelines so that we can do a program level cost of saved energy. But going forward, we also recognize that if we want to make more regional comparisons of efficiency as a resource or look at these issues, that we're going to have to sort of move up this continuum and develop more common kind of reporting definitions and reporting practices in more detail. It's clear that many program administrators report at a high level of completeness and accuracy, but we also found a good number of examples where program administrators do not provide the basic data needed to calculate the cost of saved energy at the program level. Now, the information provided may still be fine at a portfolio level or even a sector level, but as you drill down deeper, we couldn't put that information together for at least administrators in the 14 states that we looked at. And also, if you step back from this process, we do believe that there's a direct connection between the maturation of efficiency as a utility and a national resource and our ability to talk to policymakers and demonstrate that there's increased consistency in the periodic reporting of efficiency program costs and impacts across administrators and states and regions. And we think that additional rigor and completeness and standard terms and the consensus on at least the essential elements of reporting could pay significant dividends for program administrators, as well as increasing confidence among policymakers and other stakeholders in the efficiency resource. And with more consistent and comprehensive reporting, we may obtain additional insights on trends in the cost of saved energy as a resource over time, as administrators scale up efforts, why those costs might vary from place to place and year to year, and what saving energy costs among an array of strategies. In terms of next steps, we again want to encourage program administrators and state commissions to support more consistent, transparent reporting of efficiency program data. We urge folks to take a look at the program typology brief. We will be doing another webinar next week with the Consortium for Energy Efficiency that goes into much more detail about the glossary, the program analysis, the program typology that's been developed, and the cost and savings metrics. And going forward, we do hope that given sufficient interest and resources, we hope that the program impacts database that we've developed we can be updated on a periodic basis and that we can prepare comprehensive reports and policy briefs that are publicly available that explore some of the key issues in efficiency programs. And we hope to do more targeted analysis that follow trends in the cost of saved energy over time and look at statistical analysis of factors that potentially influence the cost of saved energy, whether that be program administrator experience, the level of retail rates, labor costs, state policy framework. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody for listening in, and I look forward to a good discussion and a question and answer session. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. And with that, we're going to touch on some of the questions that came in during the course of the webinar. I would invite any other folks to send in your queries, and we'll try and hit as many of them as we can. I think, Chuck and Megan, I do want to invite you to elaborate, if you want, on, I think, Chuck, you mentioned that there are a number of sources of variability. We had specifically a question that it appears as though in many cases our savings weighted averages are lower than the median cost. And does that seem to imply that there are substantial benefits from economies of scale, i.e., is it, do you tend to be less expensive if your program is bigger? Is that reasonable? Do you want to talk about maybe other factors that may kind of interrelate with the economies of scale?
I think there's some evidence that we have some very large program administrators who are offering very large programs, and so in some cases those programs tend to have lower costs of saved energy. But I think that what we need to do is we also need to keep working on. But there are other factors at play here, and because of we need to increase our confidence in the average measure lifetimes so that we can convince ourselves that this variability that we observe is just because of size of program or administrator experience or whatever. I'm not prepared to give a definitive answer yet, but I think that the evidence suggests that there are economies of scale. I think if we had better, more consistent data, we'd really be more convinced about that.
Okay, thank you. And we also, there is a question out there about the degree to which the numbers there's variability in the numbers inherent in the numbers from having different baselines against which the energy savings are calculated. Do you want to discuss what impact that might have?
I think it's a true statement. I think the reality is that we know that in states, some states calculate baselines based on current practice and codes. Other states who are starting out tend to have a little bit, their baselines might be done a little bit differently than that. There also might be more low-hanging fruit out there in terms of market penetration in some of those cases. So I think that's I think the savings estimates you see in different states, in some cases, are quite appropriately reflect where their stock's starting out from, as well as there are some differences attributable to the way in which they're calculating savings, estimating savings.
Okay, thanks. And do you want to talk any more about kind of what value the total resource cost would have as opposed to the program administrator cost, and what work we might anticipate on kind of quantifying TRC costs going forward?
I'm not sure, Megan, you want to take this one or I can take it, but.
Yeah, Chuck, why don't you go ahead and tackle it first?
Well, we are going to be putting increased emphasis in the next reports on trying to get information on participant costs. And I think we all recognize that there are some pretty significant issues in the ways that participant costs are defined and reported across states and administrators. And we're going to have to sort through that stuff. I do think that because many states use the total resource cost test, and because it provides some useful information, it's important for us to do both report program administrator costs and total resource costs, because it allows for a more complete look and picture across programs. And you can see in our data, for example, the low-income programs tend to be more expensive. One of the reasons they tend to be more expensive is because typically program administrators are paying 100% of measure costs in many cases. So it's not totally fair to compare low-income programs against other residential programs when there's customer cost contribution. We also know that low-income programs are being offered for other reasons beside cost effectiveness. There are equity issues involved, and there's other things going on. There's non-energy related savings that are happening when you try to get the house up to a level where you can weatherize it. So all those things are factors, but it is important to include information on both participant costs and program administrator costs, and we hope to do that in the future as we get a larger sample.
And Chuck, follow up there. What is your feeling on what is the most appropriate metric for comparison with generation cost? Is it the PAC or the TRC? Or are there different contexts for the comparison?
I think there's different contexts. I think that our job is to basically pursue more consistent, systematic reporting of efficiency program impacts and costs, and we can let people use those results in the context that they need to use them. It's not necessary for us to say which one's the right way to go.
Okay. And another questioner wants to know: do you feel as though the EPA proposed regulations on carbon emissions, the 111D the forthcoming 111D regulations, will put greater pressure on reaching some consistency in reporting?
I think we should have another webinar in August after EPA puts out their rules, and we'll see what they say. I mean, we don't know if efficiency is going to be a compliance strategy or not. We hope that it is one option that states can pursue and administrators, and if it is, we need to look at the kind of requirements that the air regulators are going to place on efficiency as a resource. And I think it may very well force us to think about this stuff more systematically and consistently, but it's sort of too early to tell. You have to wait till the rules come out. And again, they're going to be proposed rules, and they will be lots of comments, and we have another year to get a final rule, and I'm sure there'll be a lawsuit. So, but it's time for us, the EPA, the prospect of the EPA rules should provide a tremendous opportunity for efficiency as folks who are involved in energy efficiency to get ready, basically, to take it to a different level. Okay.
Thanks very much. I think those are about the only questions that we've got time to take. I'm going to thank both of our speakers and invite anyone who has any follow-up questions to go ahead and use the email addresses, the contact information that's now up on the screen. We'd be delighted to field any questions that you have. This, as we noted earlier, the webinar will be posted within a few days up on the resource page, and we are going to be doing some follow-on projects, and would also welcome input and feedback on what else might be done with this data set. With that, I'm going to thank all of you for attending and bid you a good day.